Hey everybody, I'm Alden from Valve, and this talk is called Steam Early Access 2025. In this talk, I'm going to be exploring how game developers are making use of early access, how they're preparing for early access, and what's changed about the program since it started in 2013. So let's get started. When I set out to write this talk, I did so with some questions in the back of my head that I had been hearing from game developers over the past few months. In particular, developers have been asking me, is early access still relevant? Is it interesting to players? Is it a good model for game developers? And is early access different now than it has been in the past? So over the course of this talk, I aim to answer these two particular questions and a few more. I set out to ask a few developers that had gone through early access recently. I reached out to the developers that have been entering or exiting early access within the last year and asked them a number of questions about their experience in early access, what they found was working well, things they tried that didn't work well. I'm going to distill down the feedback that I'd gathered from these game developers and hopefully into a form that can be useful for you as you consider whether you want to bring your game to early access or not. Through my conversations with the game developers that I've been chatting with, the answers to these questions are yes. It is still clearly relevant as a model for game developers and players, and it is also different now than it has been in the past. A quick look at the organization of this talk. We're going to start with a primer of what is early access, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, why and when to use early access, how to prepare for launching into early access, how to manage your time during early access, and when and how to transition to 1.0 and leave early access. So early access, what is it? At its core, early access is a framework of messaging to support development in cooperation with players. It is not a marketing tool. It is purely a set of messaging to help set player expectations about how you want to engage with them in game development. In particular, it impacts a couple of ways that your game shows up. On the homepage of Steam, we have a new and trending list on which early access games cannot be included. Games can be included there once you transition out of early access to full 1.0 release. Also, early access games get this nifty widget that explains that your game is in early access and gives you the opportunity to answer 5 different questions about how you plan to use early access, how long you plan to use early access, what kind of feedback you're looking for, and so on and so forth. In particular, this helps set player expectations about how you wish to engage with them and what you hope to get out of your time in early access. So that's what early access is, but is it still relevant? Couple of points that give us some confidence that it is still quite relevant for both developers and players are just the number of games making use of early access. Right now, across the Steam store, there are over 14,000 games available in early access mode. That doesn't count the games that have already transitioned through early access to 1.0. Over time, we see more and more games choosing the early access development model. So you can see here steps of more games releasing as early access over time, culminating in 2,897 new titles released as early access in 2024. We were curious how this compares to the overall number of games releasing in any given year. And what we see here is a fairly steady rate of early access releases as a percentage of all releases. So you can see somewhere between 13 and 19% of releases in any given year were early access releases. There's no clear trend upwards or downwards. So you can see that as a percentage of all releases, early access has held fairly steady. One of the points of data that gives us the most confidence that early access is still relevant and interesting to both developers and players is the percentage of top releases coming out that are early access. If we look at the 100 most popular releases that came out in 2024, 28% of those titles were either going into or coming out of early access. So early access is not limited to games of less interest or anything like that. They're still quite popular, and you might recognize some of these titles shown here as being some of the biggest releases of 2024. So why and when are developers choosing to use early access? I'm going to look at some of the responses I got from developers that I talked to about how they chose early access and why. One of the teams I talked to were the developers behind the game Drill Core. They told me that an early access release would allow for a longer development cycle that would enable them to create a much deeper and content-rich version of the game by 1.0 than would otherwise be possible. Meanwhile, the developers of Thronefall told me that they really cherished the feedback from actual players, that would help them develop the game into what it could do the best. Daedalic Entertainment, which has more than one game in early access and has released many of games in early access over the years, was able to tell me that they really focused on the teams within their publisher that were interested in engaging with the community in the way that early access supports and encourages. In general, the top reasons that game developers gave me for wanting to use early access was so that they could spend more time for the game to get developed. They really wanted the player feedback to give them confidence in the direction that they were developing. Their teams wanted to be engaged with players. They enjoyed that development model, both for having confidence in the direction they were heading, but also just part of the morale of the team. And they all described having a systems-based game where there were many combinations of different mechanics within the game, and they wanted help from players to be able to test the variety of different combinations and edge cases that could arise. So how do developers choose to prepare for early access? What are some of the things that they consider ahead of time leading into their launch into early access? One of the first things that I heard from a number of teams was making sure that their team was excited to engage with players and organizing their team and their process around engaging with players in that way. So what does it mean to plan their process? It really means looking at how they're going to be communicating with players, figuring out how often they're going to update, how often they're going to communicate, where they want to communicate with players, and expecting also and preparing their team to adapt along the way because things always change and you don't know what's coming next. I asked a number of the developers if they had concerns going into early access. Many of the teams felt pretty confident after doing quite a bit of research on other games that were using early access. One particular developer told me that their main concern going into early access was meeting player expectations. This was a theme that I heard come up a couple of times, not necessarily in the context of concerns going in, but it does arise when developers are thinking about how does early access work now and what level of preparation do they need to have their game in before they go into early access.
A lot of players, they expect a fully finished game, so it is definitely not a place to throw out a prototype. It still feels like you need a fully finished game with tons of content in order to make a good impression during early access. Kind of have all the bones of the game in there, but you don't necessarily need all the content or every feature.
So how do they build confidence? What kind of things do they do to prepare to make sure that they knew the game they were launching into early access would land and resonate the best with players? Many of the game developer teams that I talked with described some process for playtesting prior to early access. Many of them described a number of steps in progressively larger playtests to help get that confidence. So they might start out with handing out a few keys to friends of a really early build of the game. Once they get a little bit further along, maybe they use Steam Playtest to open that up to a much wider group. Maybe then they release a playable free demo so that an even wider group of players can enjoy a slice of the game. Doing this deliberate and increasingly larger playtesting and gathering the feedback that came from players during each of those phases gave these teams more and more confidence that what they had was ready and polished and into a state that was ready to go into early access. Again, many of these teams described to me wanting to build a polished vertical slice so that the game felt really polished and refined, even if not all of the content was there, and even if some of the game mechanics were missing, not wanting to ship a buggy, incomplete feeling game. Many of the development teams described to me during these playtesting steps and throughout the development of their game, the concept of establishing a core group of hardcore fans that would give them the best and the most actionable feedback. Many developers described a process of identifying the users in their communities that were the best at giving them good feedback, complete bug reports, and actionable suggestions, and then creating a smaller community or group chat with those fans so that they could use them as an early form of small testing before deploying their ideas to a much wider group. This let them test out experimental or risky ideas with a small understanding group of customers that could give them the best actionable feedback before turning that into a fully refined, polished idea that they roll out to the full early access customer group. Many of the teams talked about also establishing a very flexible and kind of vague roadmap. Internally, of course, they had a clear vision for what 1.0 would be for their game, but externally, they might only describe the next 1 or 2 or 3 milestones and in an intentionally vague way. This gave them room to adjust depending on the feedback they gathered from players and to swap out different kinds of release contents as feedback from players helped them prioritize what they were working on next. The team behind Deep Rock Galactic Survivor described to me their setup for their roadmap. They wanted to make it as easy as possible to update that roadmap as things change along the way. They had noticed a lot of really beautiful, rich, high-fidelity roadmaps that they'd seen other developers deploy on their store pages, and they wanted to take a different track of a much more minimal version of that roadmap to make it lower cost to update and thus more likely that they would update that on a regular cadence. So how did teams manage their time in early access? When I was asking about advice for other developers, one of the key points that came back was being honest, both internally and externally, about your team's limitations. In this case, the developer of the game Sulfur was describing there wasn't everything that their team could do.
We have to be honest about our limitations as a team. We're a small team. I repeat that all the time to all over the place because that has to be repeated. We're a small team and we have limitations of what we can do and how much more game we can pull out in a short amount of time, and kind of tell them about the strategies we have in place to kind of make the most of what we can do and be economic about. We have certain things we do in our game that we can do fast, and other things would take a long time to make. And it's almost a way where we have to be a bit educational about what game development is, to explain to players what those limitations are.
So being open and honest with their community about what was realistic and what was not realistic for their team to take on helped set player expectations much more clearly in the kinds of feedback that they were looking for. As a summary of the best practices that I heard from game developers, listening to feedback, communicating regularly, testing with that core group of fans, and updating regularly. Let's look at some more concrete examples of each of these points. The developers of Outlast Trials told me that if you have a clear vision for what you're trying to achieve, it makes it a lot easier to filter the feedback coming from players. The developers of the game Sulfur expressed a similar idea about filtering and prioritizing early access feedback.
What I find, if we run with or chase after ideas or opinions from our players, we risk disappointing both ourselves and maybe our players, because I think we have a pretty set and smart idea about how we bring the most game to the shortest amount of time. So we try to not chase that too much, but still, if everybody's asking for it earlier, we might put it earlier, but it's still a part of our roadmap to 1.0.
Said another way, if you have a clear vision for what you're trying to achieve, then you can dismiss feedback that is going to take you too far off that track or off into the weeds or adding huge scope to the game that you do not set out to achieve. The developers that I talked to all had some kind of lens through which they filtered the feedback coming from players. Often they would describe the concept of reading between the lines, not taking the feedback literally from players, but trying to get at the root of what those players are asking for or what kind of problem they're running into that they're trying to solve. So players may suggest one particular fix, but that may totally not be the correct fix for what you have in mind with the game. So understanding what it is that the player is trying to fix to begin with helps you focus on different ways that you may approach solving that particular problem. A lot of the teams also described to me that they used the feedback from players to help prioritize work that they already wanted to do.
We wanted to kind of iterate and figure out exactly how big we could make the game, as well as just what the players were most interested in, and kind of figuring out which direction to build it in, which has been super useful to see their feedback.
By doing this and moving things up their development schedule, they could show to players that they were responding to their feedback and also capitalize on that feedback and that interest in around particular features or scope while players are excited about it and are talking about it. And then, of course, keeping the scope of your game in mind. This kind of goes hand in hand with having a clear vision for 1.0. But if you have a clear scope for your game, then you can also filter feedback through that to avoid getting too far off into the weeds following something that wasn't really part of the core game. We also talked to developers about communication, and these developers often described that they would go out of their way to figure out the best ways of communicating with their players, both to make sure that the players are feeling like they are involved in the process, and also to make sure that those players know when to expect the next updates. Often developers describe to me making regular posts along the way, not waiting too long to communicate, being present in chat, so finding out where you're going to hang out with your players and talk to them in closer to real time, and using that as a way, at least in small forms, a little bit throughout your development, to engage with players in a more casual, intimate setting. And then also thinking about how much of your communication your team can or wants to localize. So if you have a big Japanese language player base, being able to communicate with them in Japanese might be really helpful for having them come along with you in the development process, while also thinking about your English-speaking customers and maybe your Chinese-speaking customers as well. I talked earlier about the concept of establishing a core group of fans. This is where developers told us that that core group of fans was key for being able to deploy experimental features or rough prototypes of new features to get really good feedback from those core groups before expanding and delivering that update to the wider group. Developers also described updating quickly to fix bugs, showing that you're responsive and actionable for those things that you can just fix, while taking longer to roll out big, meaningful new updates that may have a bunch of new content and new gameplay mechanics and things like that. And in general, these developer teams described to me expanding scope only when it was supported by the game and the audience, i.e., if you find a lot of success in early access and you have a lot of engagement from players that are clamoring for certain additions to the game or expansions in scope, then you might be able to justify being able to expand the game in that way. So finally, how were game developer teams choosing when to transition to 1.0, and what kind of things were they considering in order to make that transition? This graph simply shows the amount of time that games had been in early access and transitioned to 1.0. The things not represented on this graph are the games that are still in early access and still updating, still engaging with players, maybe after many, many years. There are games in early access that have been in early access for 10 years, and they're still finding quite a bit of value in being in early access and engaging with players that way. Having said that, for the games that have transitioned out of early access to 1.0, we find that some number of them have spent less than a year, some number have spent a year to 2 years, and so on and so forth. But it's really going to vary from game to game. There's not one right answer here. It's going to depend on the size of your game, the eagerness of your team, and what you set out to accomplish to begin with. In asking the developers that I talked with, a couple of them expressed a specific desire to have a short, concise time frame in early access. For example, the team behind the game Sulfur described to me that they wanted to move through early access in a reasonable amount of time, and I think in their picture was a year, 2 years. And if they took too long, well, they might get kind of burnt out. They might disappoint players that they weren't delivering that full 1.0 experience in a fast enough time. The developers of Outlast Trials described that they pushed themselves to deliver less than a year after the launch of early access, that was one of their goals going in. They wanted to move through early access in less than a year. As a counterpoint, the team behind Deep Rock Galactic Survivor described less of a specific time frame for moving through early access and more about the level of finish and polish that they hope to achieve before they transitioned out of early access. I also asked developers about how they planned to, or how they did, transition to 1.0. What kind of things were top of mind? What kind of things were important to them? The common themes that I heard from these developers was that they wanted to make a splash with 1.0 launch. They wanted to align it with other platforms, so releasing on other platforms that were not previously available on, and that it was important to plan ahead for any price changes or discounts that they wanted to roll out around that launch. Let's take a closer look at these points. So when these developers talked about making a splash, they described to me the concept of an update that was not just another update, but a bigger, maybe a capstone update. It might be the final boss, it might be the final level, it might be the end of the story that they've been building throughout the development. So this big update rolling out to coincide with their 1.0 transition was often described as something bigger than just a regular content update. These teams also described wanting to launch on other platforms and timing that with their 1.0 release. This is a nice approach because it capitalizes on a lot of buzz happening among players across different platforms and gets them to all be excited about the same product at the same time. And then the words of caution that I heard from game developers was just planning ahead for any price changes that you want to make to the game and any discounts that you want to run in or around the launch of your game at 1.0. In particular, some of the things to keep in mind: some games increase the price of their game over their time in early access as they feel like they are adding more value for new customers coming into the game. By the time they get to 1.0, they feel like the game is 2 or 3 or 4 times bigger than it was when they first launched, and so the price should reflect that. An option available on Steam is to run a launch discount. So when you go to 1.0, you can offer a discount on the first week of sales of your game. You can also run your own custom discount at any time. You do want to think about if you are increasing the price of your game, there is a 30-day cooldown after the increase of a price before you can run a discount. So developers also described to me wanting to look ahead on the various upcoming opportunities, whether that's official Steam sale events or third-party events that are happening on Steam, or other opportunities to run discounts on their game that they want to participate in, and planning carefully around when that 1.0 transition happens, when they schedule any price increases, and when those discounts are to take place. So in this talk, I set out to answer, is early access still relevant? Yes, as we've found, it is popular as ever, with more and more games releasing in early access, and about the same percentage of all releases choosing early access. Plus, many of the top-selling new releases coming out every year are using early access as their development model. Secondly, we asked, is early access different now than in the past? And the answer was yes. Player expectations are higher as to the quality and polish of the game going into early access. Thank you to the folks behind these teams that took the time to answer questions and provide us with their insights and how they approached early access. And thank you all for joining us in this talk. I hope you found this helpful. And if you're looking for more resources, you can click the URL below or scan this QR code to find early access documentation.